You probably think Antarctica is a frozen continent at the very bottom of the map. Distant, empty, too cold for life, too far removed from anything that matters. A giant white nothing that exists mostly as a reminder that cartographers had to put something down there. And, you're right, about 1% of the story. But the truth is, sealed beneath 4 kilometers of ice are vast liquid lakes, physically cut off from the sun for 15 million years. Down in that absolute darkness, water exists as a highly pressurized chemical cooker, harboring biological ecosystems that survive by rules completely alien to the rest of the Earth. Deeper still, buried within the continent's bedrock, is a jagged mountain range the size of the Alps that no human eye has ever seen. It acts as the foundation for an environment that routinely fires impossible subatomic signals up out of the ice, baffling physicists for 2 decades. Yet, the most immediate threat isn't physical. In the year 2048, the single international clause protecting this continent from industrial dissection will expire. That clause is the only thing legally standing between this continent and what is hidden beneath its seafloor. The world's leading superpowers are already well aware. They have been mapping it for years, operating under the protective flags of peaceful scientific research. All for the sake of science, of course. This is not a dead wasteland. It is an active, hostile system. But to understand how it dictates the future of the Earth, we must begin with what is hidden deepest of all. Imagine standing on the surface of the East Antarctic ice sheet. The temperature is minus 60 degrees Celsius. Beneath your boots is solid, dead ice. But if you were to take a drill and cut straight down through 4 kilometers of that frozen mass, you wouldn't hit bedrock. You would hit water. Beneath the glacier lies a sprawling, active hydrological network of over 675 subglacial lakes, connected by rivers that stretch for thousands of kilometers. And the undisputed king of this underworld is Lake Vostok. It is a massive reservoir rivaling Lake Ontario, stretching for 250 kilometers in absolute darkness. The water down there is subjected to a crushing pressure of 350 atmospheres. But the true lethal factor is its chemistry. As the base of the glacier slowly melts into the lake, it releases millions of ancient, trapped air bubbles. The massive hydrostatic pressure crushes these bubbles, forcing the gases to dissolve directly into the water. The result is an oxygen concentration 50 times higher than a normal surface lake. At these levels, oxygen ceases to be life-giving. It becomes a toxic solvent that shreds cellular walls and destroys DNA. But to find out if anything could survive in such a lethal soup, we had to reach it first. And the only way in was straight down, through kilometers of solid ice. In 1989, a joint Russian, French and American team began cutting a path down to Vostok. But getting there required pumping the borehole full of fluids to keep the extreme cold from instantly freezing the hole shut. They poured roughly 60 tons of aviation kerosene and Freon 141b, as a result of which this toxic mixture entered the ice mass. By 1998, they stopped just 130 meters above the lake's surface because they hit a fatal flaw in their own engineering. Breaking through meant pouring toxic industrial chemicals straight into the most pristine ecosystem on the planet. When in February 2012 they finally resolved to breach the lake, the extreme hydrostatic pressure actually saved them. Water violently rushed up the borehole, rising 500 meters and pushing the kerosene out of the way before freezing into a solid ice plug. They sampled that frozen plug later. But to this day, a bitter debate rages in the scientific community. Did they pull up unique alien Vostok extremophiles, or just contamination from the drill itself? We needed a cleaner look. So, later American-led scientific projects like Wizard and SALSA targeted shallower, more active systems, Lakes Willans and Mercer, buried under a mere 800 to 1,000 meters of ice. This time, they used sterile, hot water drills with surgical precision. What they pulled up shattered the fundamental rules of biology. In absolute darkness, where photosynthesis is physically impossible, they extracted over 1,300 distinct genetic profiles of bacteria and archaea. These are thriving ecosystems. They survive by eating the continent itself. They literally consume the iron and sulfur ground up by the movement of the glacier against the bedrock. This discovery serves as a direct foundation for applied astrobiology. When NASA designs probes to search for life in the sub-ice oceans of Jupiter's moon Europa or Saturn's Enceladus, they use these subglacial lakes as their primary blueprint. Europa's ocean is locked under kilometers of an icy crust, bombarded by radiation and cut off from solar energy, identical to the conditions beneath the Antarctic ice. If biology can hack the survival code here, in the dark, chewing on bedrock, then the moons of the outer solar system are likely not as dead as they appear. We found life, but the most terrifying and awe-inspiring part of this discovery is the absolute hermetic isolation. These ecosystems have been locked in a vault, evolving completely separated from the rest of the Earth's biosphere for 15 million years. We barely scratched the surface of these waters, and we still don't know the full extent of what existed down there before we forced our drills into the ice. Yet, these isolated lakes are just water trapped in the crevices of a much larger physical machine. The only reason they exist under such extreme pressure is because of the sealing that seals them in. 4 kilometers of solid ice doesn't just block the sun, it possesses a devastating mechanical weight. The sheer mass of the Antarctic ice sheet, totaling 30 million cubic kilometers of ice, has physically shoved the continental bedrock deep into the Earth's mantle. It is a phenomenon known as isostatic depression. If you could magically snap your fingers and instantly remove that ice, you wouldn't see a normal landmass. You would find a crushed, deformed ghost of a once existent continent. Because the crust has been pushed down so far, it would take the mantle tens of thousands of years to slowly flow back and push the bedrock up to a normal sea level. In West Antarctica, this depression reaches its terrifying extreme at the Bentley Subglacial Trench. The bedrock here plunges 2,538 meters below sea level. For context, if you stood at the bottom of this trench, you would be buried 3 times deeper than the height of the Burj Khalifa. Yet, you would be standing on continental rock, not the ocean floor. If the ice instantly vanished today, the ocean would violently rush in. West Antarctica would cease to exist as a contiguous landmass, immediately shattering into a submerged archipelago of volcanic islands. The continent of Antarctica is essentially 2 completely different worlds forced together under one frozen roof. West Antarctica is a volatile, fractured rift system, a literal continuation of the Andes mountain range, harboring active volcanoes directly beneath the ice. East Antarctica is the polar opposite. It is a monolithic craton, an ancient and unbreakable shield forged 1 billion years ago. Buried beneath the dead center of that ancient eastern shield are the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. They are identical in scale to the European Alps, with jagged peaks rising 2.5 kilometers high and deep, plunging valleys. By the standard laws of geology, these peaks should have been completely annihilated. The relentless grinding of a continental glacier over millions of years acts like planetary sandpaper. It should have ground these mountains down to a flat plain. Instead of destroying the mountains, the ice mummified them. When the East Antarctic ice sheet formed 34 million years ago, it flash froze the topography. The glacier essentially locked the peaks in a frozen vacuum, reducing erosion to near zero. Researchers have mapped their jagged ridges using penetrating radar from the BedMap 3 project. But no human eye has ever looked upon them, no human foot has ever touched their stone, and most likely, for the next hundreds of years, no one will set foot on or see these mountains. The Gamburtsevs stand as a monument to preservation. However, buried in the bedrock of East Antarctica is another structure entirely, a massive gravitational scar etched directly into the continental plate. This 500-kilometer anomaly points to the precise moment when almost all life on Earth was simultaneously eradicated. In 2006, NASA's GRACE satellites, twin probes flying in tandem to measure microscopic fluctuations in Earth's gravitational field, passed over the Wilkes land region of East Antarctica. They detected a severe anomaly. Deep beneath the ice, there is a mascon, a massive concentration of dense mantle material that has welled up into the crust. Surrounding this heavy center is a circular depression 500 kilometers across. This is the physical signature of an impact crater. The scale of this scar defies normal comprehension. The asteroid that struck the Yucatan Peninsula and exterminated the dinosaurs measured roughly 10 kilometers across, leaving a crater 150 kilometers wide. By comparison, the object that slammed into the Wilkes Land region of Antarctica was nearly 50 kilometers in diameter, a rock the size of a sprawling metropolis. It struck the Earth with at least 3 times the kinetic energy of the dinosaur killer. The timing of this gravitational scar aligns with a geological nightmare that occurred 251 million years ago, the Permian-Triassic boundary, colloquially known as the Great Dying. This event triggered a catastrophic, systemic collapse of the entire biosphere. The mechanical force of the Wilkes Land impact shattered the continental crust and sent immense seismic shockwaves rippling through the planet's interior. This kinetic transfer of energy acted as a planetary detonator, likely accelerating the eruption of the Siberian traps on the opposite side of the globe. Millions of tons of magma, carbon dioxide, and toxic sulfur flooded the atmosphere. Carbon levels skyrocketed from 400 to over 2,500 parts per million. The resulting chain reaction was lethal. The oceans absorbed the heat and rapidly lost their ability to hold dissolved oxygen. They transformed into stagnant acidic pools choked with hydrogen sulfide. In a geological blink, 96% of all marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrates suffocated or starved. Life on Earth was pushed to the absolute brink of total erasure. Currently, the connection between the Wilkes Land strike and the Great Dying remains a forensic hypothesis. To definitively prove this crater is the smoking gun of the apocalypse, geologists need physical samples from the crater floor, specifically shocked quartz, iridium, and impact breccia from the crater floor. But the continent refuses to yield its evidence. Perhaps under this ice lies the definitive cause of the near-total destruction of life on our planet. We will not get the final answer until the glacier finally retreats. While that frozen armor remains intact, the continent continually shields itself from external forces. Antarctica functions as a massive, self-sustaining isolation machine, wielding oceanic currents and violent atmospheric physics to keep the rest of the world completely blocked out. The primary physical barrier sealing Antarctica from the rest of the planet is a perpetual oceanic storm. The Antarctic circumpolar current circles the landmass without ever hitting another continent. It moves 173 million cubic meters of water every single second, a flow rate of 173 sverdrups. This continuous, unbroken rotation creates an impenetrable kinetic wall. It physically traps cold water against the coastline and repels the warm ocean currents attempting to flow down from the equator, locking the continent in an eternal thermal deficit. Above the water, the atmosphere operates as a secondary defense mechanism. The high-altitude air over the central polar plateau becomes extremely cold and dense. Gravity pulls this heavy mass down the steep coastal slopes, accelerating it into katabatic winds. These gravity-driven storms reach speeds of 327 kilometers per hour, stripping moisture from the air and physically scouring the bedrock. The combination of this thermal moat and violent wind produces a stark geographical paradox. Across a landmass practically forged from ice, there exists a massive region known as the McMurdo Dry Valleys, where snow has not accumulated for millions of years. The surrounding transantarctic mountains act as a physical shield against the advancing ice sheet, while the katabatic winds vaporize any moisture the moment it falls. The region receives less than 100 millimeters of water-equivalent precipitation annually, almost all of which sublimates directly into the air. It is an expanse of completely bare, frozen dirt and exposed stone. The environment perfectly mirrors the extreme cold, hyper-aridity, and harsh soil chemistry of the Red Planet, which is exactly why NASA uses these valleys as the primary testing ground for its Martian rovers. The only active hydrology in this barren stretch is the Onyx River. For 10 months of the year, it is a solid ribbon of ice. It thaws and flows for only 2 months during the absolute peak of the austral summer, dragging mineral-rich water inland before terminating in a closed, dead-end basin called Lake Vanda. Since the lake has no outlet to the ocean, it functions as a hypersalty reservoir, retaining dissolved minerals in natural waters that are 10 times saltier than those of the ocean. Antarctica isolates itself with such mechanical efficiency that it creates a completely sterile, uncontaminated environment. But by blocking out the biological and thermal noise of the rest of the planet, the continent has accidentally become the perfect, pristine receiver for anomalies falling from space. Because Antarctica is devoid of biological interference and massive human infrastructure, it functions as a pristine receiver for extraterrestrial material. Meteorites strike the Earth evenly, but usually they vanish into the grass or get lost in the depths of the ocean. In Antarctica, the glacier acts as a mechanical conveyor belt. Under the immense weight of the continent, the solid ice actually behaves like a highly viscous fluid, slowly creeping outward from the center. Rocks from space fall onto the vast polar plateau, sink into the ice, and are slowly dragged outward by this glacial flow. When this moving ice collides with the submerged bedrock of the transantarctic mountains, it is forced upward. The ferocious katabatic winds then strip away the rising ice through ablation, essentially a process where the dry winds evaporate the ice directly into water vapor without it ever melting into liquid. This leaves thousands of extraterrestrial rocks pooled on the frozen surface. Over 45,000 meteorites have been harvested from these blue ice fields. Among these thousands of stones, researchers even discovered a fragment of the Martian crust, ALH-8 4001, a 1.93 kilogram rock. The continent physically transported pieces of another planet to the surface for collection. But meteorites aren't the only thing the ice is catching. It can also detect subatomic particles as they pass through the planet. At the South Pole, scientists embedded 5,000 spherical optical sensors into a solid cubic kilometer of the glacier to create the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory. At depths of 2.5 kilometers, the intense pressure squeezes all air bubbles out of the ice, creating a perfectly transparent medium. When high-energy particles from deep space crash into the oxygen atoms trapped in the ice, they create a microscopic subatomic sonic boom. This reaction emits a faint, distinct blue flash called Cherenkov radiation. The sensors detect these flashes, effectively turning the deep Antarctic ice into a massive, noise-free telescope. There is also another detector. The Antarctic Impulsive Transient Antenna, or ANITA, is a radio detector suspended from a helium balloon floating 35 kilometers above the continent. It is designed to hunt for ultra-high-energy cosmic rays falling from deep space. It scans the massive white expanse of the ice sheet for radio pulses generated by the Ascarian effect, a phenomenon where these spaceborne particles crash down into the ice and emit a distinct cone of radio waves. In 2006 and again in 2014, ANITA recorded severe anomalies. The sensors detected the unmistakable signature of high-energy tau neutrinos. The physics data was completely clear, but the trajectory was impossible. These particles were not falling down from space. They were firing straight up, bursting out of the Antarctic ice. According to the standard model of the particle physics, this cannot happen. Neutrinos are subatomic particles blasted out by exploding stars and black holes millions of light years away. Standard low-energy neutrinos are like ghosts. They can pass clean through the Earth without hitting anything. But ultra-high-energy tau neutrinos are packed with so much energy that they possess a massive cross-section. To them, the Earth is physically opaque, like a solid brick wall. They should have collided with the planet's crust on the other side of the globe and stopped entirely. For them to emerge from the ice and hit the ANITA balloon, they would have had to pass through 12,700 kilometers of solid rock and magma entirely unimpeded. For nearly 2 decades, physicists have debated this signal. No conventional model explains it. The continent accidentally caught a cosmic anomaly that completely defies our foundational understanding of the universe, shattering fundamental concepts of physics. But while the Antarctic environment breaks the laws of the cosmos, it also systematically breaks down the physiology of the people who come to study it. The continent of Antarctica is the only landmass on Earth that legally and practically demands surgical preparation for prolonged entry. It is not just a matter of extreme cold, it is a matter of absolute, unbreakable isolation. If you intend to stay through the austral winter at deep field research bases, passing a standard physical is not enough. You must undergo prophylactic surgery. Doctors will proactively remove your appendix even if it is perfectly healthy. Wisdom teeth are often extracted in advance. The reason is simple: if something goes wrong, there is no way out. From February to October, the continent locks its doors. Temperatures on the polar plateau plunge to -80 degrees Celsius. At these extremes, the physical properties of modern aviation fail. Aviation fuel turns into a highly viscous gel. Hydraulic fluids freeze solid. The steel and aluminum components of aircraft frames become so brittle they can shatter under stress. For 8 continuous months, it is physically impossible for a plane to land or take off. If an internal organ ruptures during this window, no one is coming to save you. You are farther from rescue than the astronauts on the International Space Station, who can return to Earth in a matter of hours. But even if your organs remain intact, the continent attacks your neurology. Researchers at the Charité Hospital in Berlin conducted MRI scans on personnel wintering at the Neumeier 3rd station. They discovered a phenomenon known as winter over syndrome. The total absence of a sun-driven day-night cycle destroys the body's circadian rhythm. This leads to chronic insomnia and severe sensory deprivation, a state where the silent, featureless environment provides so little external stimulation that the brain struggles to anchor itself to reality. Under these conditions, personnel can slip into fugue states, experiencing terrifying gaps in memory where they wander the station or perform tasks with absolutely no recollection of doing so. Staring into a flat white void for months on end physically starves the brain of visual and spatial stimuli. As a direct consequence, the researchers measured a 7% shrinkage in the volume of the dentate gyrus, a critical part of the hippocampus responsible for spatial thinking and memory. The isolation literally consumes your brain tissue. Today, we understand these brutal medical realities. We combat them with psychological screenings, high-tech communication, and preemptive surgery. But imagine the first people who discovered this continent and pushed into its frozen depths a century ago. They had none of this data. They walked into a physical and neurological meat grinder completely blind, relying on nothing but canvas tents and their own dying tissues. On November 12, 1912, a search party moving across the Ross ice shelf spotted a mound of snow. Digging it out, they uncovered a canvas tent. Inside lay the frozen bodies of Captain Robert Falcon Scott and his final 2 companions. They had frozen to death during a catastrophic blizzard, exactly 18 kilometers short of a massive supply cache known as One Ton Depot. The most shocking detail of this scene was what the search party found strapped to the team's metal sledges. Alongside the frozen sleeping bags and empty ration tins sat 16 kilograms of plain, jagged rocks. To understand why they were hauling those god-forsaken rocks, You have to rewind the timeline. The British Terra Nova expedition had sailed across the world on a wooden whaling ship just to reach the frozen coastline of Antarctica. From there, they marched for months, dragging heavy sledges hundreds of miles inward into the absolute unknown. On January 17th, Captain Scott and his team finally reached the South Pole, only to find a tent and a Norwegian flag planted by Roald Amundsen 34 days prior. It was a crushing psychological blow. Defeated and exhausted, the British team now faced an 800-mile march back to the coast. From mid-January to early February, an unexpectedly sharp drop in temperature caught them off guard, and their bodies began breaking down on a cellular level. Scurvy was dissolving their connective tissues. Extreme frostbite was turning their extremities black with gangrene. The ambient temperature plunged to -40, transforming the surface ice into sharp granules that generated immense physical friction against the sledge runners. Every single step required burning calories their bodies simply did not have, forcing their metabolisms to cannibalize their own muscle tissue. We know these precise visceral details because Captain Scott relentlessly documented their physical degradation in his expedition diaries. Petty Officer Edgar Evans succumbed to a severe concussion and physical trauma at the base of a glacier. Shortly after, Army Captain Lawrence Oates, suffering from severe frostbite, deliberately walked out of the tent into a blizzard to relieve the burden on the survivors. Right in the middle of this escalating death spiral, while descending the Beardmore Glacier on February 8th, the remaining men stopped. Scott and his second-in-command, Chief Scientist Dr. Edward Wilson, spent hours chiseling specimens out of the exposed rock of the glacier's moraine. They deliberately added 16 kilograms of dead weight to their sledges. They chose to drag these rocks across the ice while their own bodies were actively dying from starvation and exhaustion. By late March, Scott, Wilson, and Lieutenant Henry Bowers were trapped in their tent by a relentless blizzard. They were exactly 18 kilometers from One Ton Depot and its life-saving food and fuel. It was a distance they could have survived if the weather had held. Instead, they froze to death in the dark. Scott wrote his final diary entries as the men died beside him. They perished, never knowing if the rocks strapped to their sledges outside were of any scientific value, or if they had dragged that dead weight for nothing. But those diaries survived to tell us their story, and history proved they did not carry those stones in vain. Their decision was driven by pure scientific clarity. Dr. Wilson had spotted something physically impossible embedded in the stone. It was a piece of coal containing the beautifully preserved fossilized imprints of broad, veined leaves. It was Glossopteris, an extinct species of seed fern. In 1912, mainstream geology dictated that the Earth's continents were rigidly fixed in place. However, a heavy-seeded temperate fern cannot swim across thousands of miles of freezing ocean to take root on an isolated polar ice cap. The presence of these leaves proved an undeniable mechanical reality. Antarctica was not always at the bottom of the world, and it was not always isolated. Those 16 kilograms of stone became the physical bedrock for the theory of continental drift. They proved that Antarctica was once physically welded to South America, Africa, and Australia in a supercontinent called Gondwana. Scott's team dragged the very evidence of a radically different Earth to their graves. They gave their lives to prove that this frozen wasteland was once a thriving, temperate environment, and their fossils force us to confront a terrifying planetary mechanic. Antarctica went from a humid greenhouse to a suffocating icebox in a geologically short span of time. The continent we see today is just the current phase of an active, changing system. The fossils Scott's team dragged through the blizzard were a direct receipt from the Eocene epoch. 50 million years ago, if you stood on the shores of Antarctica, you would not need a winter coat. The average annual temperature hovered around 11 degrees Celsius. The coastline was framed by dense forests of southern beech trees and palms. Instead of emperor penguins, the apex predators of this coast were pelagornithids. These were monstrous seabirds boasting a 6-meter wingspan. Their jaws were lined with jagged, bony spikes that functioned exactly like teeth, designed to snatch slippery prey from warm, open waters. Terrestrial mammals freely roamed across the landmass, using the green, unfrozen continent as a land bridge to Australia. This lush tropical world was erased 34 million years ago during the Eocene-Oligocene transition. The collapse of this ecosystem was a violent, systematic shutdown. As tectonic plates shifted, South America and Australia tore away from Antarctica. This violent continental separation opened the deep oceanic gateways, giving birth to the Antarctic circumpolar current. Once that kinetic wall of water encircled the landmass, the warm equatorial currents were permanently blocked. The continent was instantly thermally isolated. Temperatures plummeted. The high peaks of the Gumburtsev Mountains acted as the inception point for massive glaciers, which rapidly spilled outward, flash freezing the forests and burying the coastline. In a geologically short window, Antarctica went from a humid greenhouse to a suffocating icebox. The entire system inverted. But a planetary machine that can freeze can also unfreeze. Today, the continent is actively reversing its thermodynamic state. Satellites monitoring the Antarctic Peninsula are currently recording a physical change in the continent's surface. The pristine white ice is actively changing color, infected by a phenomenon that biologists track as green snow. The surface of the glacier is being colonized by extremophile microscopic algae, primarily species like Chlamydomonas nivalis. For 8 months of the year, these single-celled organisms lie completely dormant, frozen solid in the deep sub-zero temperatures. But when the brief austral summer arrives and the ambient temperature rises just fractions of a degree above zero, microscopic layers of liquid water form between the ice crystals. That minimal moisture becomes the trigger. The algae wake up and rapidly multiply by the trillions. To survive the intense, unshielded ultraviolet radiation bombarding the polar surface, they produce heavy concentrations of chlorophyll and secondary dark pigments, such as carotenoids. This biological shield violently alters the physical properties of the ice. White snow is an incredibly efficient planetary mirror. It possesses a high albedo, reflecting approximately 80% of incoming solar radiation straight back into space. But when the algae bloom and turn the snowpack green, that albedo plummets to 45%. Suddenly, the surface of the glacier is no longer reflecting the sun's energy. It is physically absorbing nearly 3 times as much of the incoming heat. This triggers a ruthless, self-sustaining thermodynamic reaction. The dark algae trap heat, which warms the ice directly beneath them. That localized heating melts more frozen snow, creating a larger supply of liquid water. Since liquid water is the single limiting factor for extremophile reproduction, the newly melted water allows the algae colony to rapidly expand its perimeter. The larger the green stain becomes, the more solar radiation it absorbs, which generates even more meltwater. It is a fatal biological feedback loop that feeds on its own destruction. In 2020, researchers from the University of Cambridge utilized high-resolution data from the European Space Agency's Sentinel-2 satellites to measure the exact scale of this melt. They documented over 1,700 independent algal blooms scattered across the Antarctic Peninsula. These patches form a creeping biological sludge that consumes thousands of tons of carbon while systematically accelerating the destruction of the coastal ice sheet. This melting process is a physical chain reaction that cannot be halted by human legislation or administrative treaties. The ice is retreating, and as the coastal glaciers thin and pull back, they are slowly exposing the ancient continental shelf and the bedrock beneath. What is locked inside that geological vault is precisely why the most powerful nations on Earth are silently preparing for the year 2048. In 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty, officially declaring the continent a demilitarized zone dedicated exclusively to peaceful scientific research. During the absolute height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed to leave a landmass larger than Europe, entirely untouched. But this treaty was not born of noble pacifism. It was a product of pure logistical pragmatism. In the mid-20th century, the extreme physical thickness of the ice, the catastrophic cold, and the impenetrable barrier of the circumpolar current made military occupation and industrial extraction a physical impossibility. Peace was the only mathematically viable option. In 1991, this ceasefire was legally reinforced by the Madrid Protocol. Article 7 of this document contains a single, definitive sentence. Any activity relating to mineral resources other than scientific research shall be prohibited. That specific piece of paper created the modern illusion of Antarctica as a perpetual global reserve. It conditioned the world to view the continent as a politically neutral sanctuary. But international treaties are not the laws of physics. The Madrid Protocol entered into force in 1998, and buried within its legal framework is a specific 50-year clause. In the year 2048, the window for revision officially opens. At that precise moment, any of the consultative parties can demand a review conference. The procedural threshold required to modify or entirely lift the prohibition on mining drops significantly. In exactly 25 years, the legal shield protecting the continent from industrial dissection becomes entirely vulnerable. The global superpowers are not waiting for the deadline to arrive. They are actively preparing for it right now. The prize locked beneath the ice and the surrounding ocean floor is astronomical. Geological surveys estimate that the sedimentary basins of the Southern Ocean, specifically the Ross Sea and the Weddell Sea, conceal over 500 billion barrels of oil and gas reserves. The transantarctic mountains hold massive seams of coal, while the bedrock of the Eastern Shield is packed with iron ore and rare earth elements. Because Article 7 prohibits commercial extraction but explicitly permits scientific research, the race for these resources is currently operating under the camouflage of academia. For the past 2 decades, state-backed geological vessels have been systematically mapping the Antarctic continental shelf. Ships equipped with arrays of seismic airguns sail back and forth across the freezing waters, firing high-pressure acoustic blasts deep into the seabed. The returning echoes generate highly detailed 3-dimensional maps of the subterranean oil and gas traps. Officially, these missions are cataloging tectonic history. In reality, they are calculating the precise coordinates for future drilling rigs. This silent land grab extends far beyond geology. Some nations are even weaponizing childbirth to stake territorial claims. Argentina famously airlifted a pregnant woman to their Esperanza base just so her son could be the first documented human born on the continent, essentially turning a birth certificate into a deed of ownership. Meanwhile, the continent is also undergoing a rapid, hidden militarization, exploiting the treaty's allowance for dual-use infrastructure. Because of Antarctica's unique position at the bottom of the globe, it is the ultimate terrestrial relay point for satellites in polar orbits. Over the last few years, several nations have aggressively expanded their ground station networks across the ice. Massive, protective radomes now dot the frozen landscape. While these antennas pull down crucial weather and climate data, they are simultaneously integrated into global military navigation systems, including Russia's GLONASS and China's Beidou. The exact same telemetry data used to track shifting glaciers is required to guide intercontinental ballistic missiles and synchronize orbital spy satellites. If a nation controls the telemetry uplinks in Antarctica, it possesses a massive tactical advantage in any future global conflict. The physical footprint of these operations is also shifting from lightweight scientific outposts to heavy force projection. Engineers are actively carving 3-kilometer-long runways directly into the blue ice of the polar plateau. These reinforced airstrips are not built to land small twin-engine civilian planes. They are specifically engineered to accommodate massive four-engine military transport aircraft, like the Boeing C-17 Globemaster III and the Ilyushin Il-76. You do not need a military cargo plane capable of hauling 70 tons of equipment just to drop off a few dozen biologists and their ice cores. You build that infrastructure to ensure you can rapidly deploy heavy machinery, heavy vehicles, and personnel the moment the legal landscape changes. Antarctica is a geopolitical time bomb, ticking down to a specific year. For centuries, humanity looked at the bottom of the map and saw a dead, frozen wasteland, a blank canvas waiting to be conquered. But the ice has proven us wrong at every single turn. Antarctica is not an empty desert. It is a massive, hostile, and actively functioning planetary system. It is a vault protecting 15-million-year-old biological ecosystems that consume the bedrock in absolute darkness. It is a gravitational graveyard hiding the physical scars of an apocalyptic extinction. It is a flawless cosmic telescope catching subatomic particles that shatter the standard model of physics. And right now, as the algae bloom and the coastal glaciers thin, it is a ticking geopolitical time bomb preparing to detonate in the year 2048. When that legal deadline arrives and the subterranean oil traps are finally exposed, what happens next? Do we actually believe we can safely dissect the resources of a continent that actively shrinks the brains of the people who winter on it? Or will the extreme physical reality of the ice simply outlast our political ambitions? Antarctica is a stark reminder that the Earth is a complex, indifferent mechanism. It does not negotiate, and it does not require our permission to operate. But it is not the only isolated extreme on this planet where human logic completely breaks down. There is another place, hidden from the sun, where the sheer physical weight of the environment alters the molecular composition of metal, and where biology survives by an entirely different set of rules. I release new deep dive video every week. Our next journey takes us there, to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. Subscribe to stay tuned.